Hi everyone, my name's Riley Batchelor. I'm the CEO of an organisation called EduGrowth. We're an acceleration network from Australia, hence the funny accent. I hope you can understand me. I'll try and talk a bit slower perhaps, but we'll see how we go. We've got a lot to get through, so not too slow. So we're here today to talk about scalable, borderless, higher education, new models, ready or not. And firstly, I'd just like to quickly introduce the panel that we have here today. On the end, we have Mr. Tom Dretler, the CEO of Shorelight Education. We have Patrick Brothers, the CEO of Navitas Ventures and also the CDO of Navitas, also from Australia. We have Lucy Stonehill, the CEO of BridgeU, and Jeremy Cooper, the Managing Director, EMEA of Hobson.
And Riley, I think I'm the only one without the funny accent on the stage.
We do have a very international panel.
I'm from Boston. A lot of
we're
people
hoping
think
for a
our
good
accents are
international
funny.
debate here. Anyone else in the crowd from Australia? Good to see. We brought a few of you guys in.
Wow.
All right, so I'm just going to try to introduce the topic a little bit and then I'm going to pass it over to the panel. So this idea of scalable, borderless higher education, what we're really hoping to talk about today is this move from traditional international education market of learners coming to the US, the UK, Australia and Canada for traditional education. We're moving beyond that to a global market that knows no borders, a borderless market. And with that, it means significant change and disruption for the market, but also a huge amount of opportunity for the institutions, the startups, the providers, the vendors that are in the industry to definitely benefit from the amount of change that's coming through. There's been some recent research that forecasts that there's going to be around 1 billion learners by 2025 that are looking for a good, high-quality education. I don't think we can fit them all into the US or Australia or the UK. So it's much bigger, it's much more broad than that. The topics we're going to touch on today is really what's driving that change, where's it coming from, why is it here. We're going to look into the future, obviously. We're going to talk about some changes in business models for all involved. We'll talk about government policy and the Trump effect, if you will, on this industry. And it'd be good to focus on how institutions can capitalize on this opportunity and serve global learners at scale. So to kick it off, I might just go through the panel, perhaps starting with you, Tom, just to get your definition of scalable, borderless education and your very early thoughts on this change.
I think that learners want to go to where the best schools are, and I think there's more information available, and there's rising wealth classes who have smartphones and more information, and if they have the means, they're going to go where they think they can get the best education. There's outstanding, we've joked about it, but we've got the UK, Australia, and the US represented here, not just in sort of our origins, but I think all of us are working across those geographies. Canada too is another popular destination. But I think if you're coming from a country where you don't think that inside that country you're going to get the best education, and you have the willingness to travel and you have the means, you're going to go to the best school you can and hopefully build a better life if you're a parent for your child. And I think that's one of the main things that's driving it. And so then it gets to be a capacity issue if we're talking about physical. And if we're talking about digital delivery of education, then we can think about other ways to serve, and that would have some different effects on borderless higher education.
Yeah, Navitas, and I suppose from an Australian perspective, that's where most of our partnerships are. We're engaged in a conversation that the Australian government started about 2 years ago, which was what does international education look like in 2025, and how does Australia retain a kind of leadership position? And talking about the forecast of 8 million, international students and the like, and kind of, you said it, Riley, that what struck us is how that 8 million number compares to the billion learners number. And Tom's right. There's still a really strong value proposition for the way we think of international education today. But when it was framed as 2025, there was a bunch of us kind of thinking, "Wow, that's interesting." I've no doubt there'll still be that really strong desire for the study destination, but from the kind of sessions that you sit in here, it makes you wonder whether there'll be another opportunity, scalable, borderless. I suppose that's how I kind of think about it. Today we're thinking about it very much about travelling to have an international education experience, but will we see, I think it's Arizona State who has the Global Freshman Academy, which is freshmen in the cloud, if you like. That sounds really interesting.
Lucy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, from my perspective, so at my company, we work, we consider our end users to be students. So these are otherwise the kind of consumers of the type of higher education opportunities we're talking about. I think for them, this idea of sort of truly borderless is the sort of concept that you can choose between global opportunities and treat them as sort of apples and apples versus completely apples and oranges, whereby the opportunities that you might get in one country, which have typically been reserved for maybe the few and the far between, might then also be offered closer by within your country or your own kind of continent. So thinking about the sort of concept of national borders when it comes to post-secondary opportunities as really being more porous than they ever have been before. I think that's how we like to think of ourselves as supporting that journey for our students. And then I think, the scalable piece as well from the perspective of the students who are driving this demand. I think some of the stats around, we've talked about this, some of the stats around this space are really quite staggering. So there's 160 million students enrolled in higher education today. That's due to be 260 million in less than 10 years. And I read an article the other day whereby they said in order to actually, for universities around the world, in order to actually kind of meet that demand, we'd have to create 2 new physical institutions per day for the next 30 years, which, perhaps is the ambition of certain governments, but is a lofty goal. And so for me, there's the concept of sort of scalability is actually how are we going to meet that demand?
Yep, I'd agree with everything everyone's said so far. I think it's very exhilarating, but kind of ironic. We're talking around borderless education at a time when really borders are probably more politically charged than ever. And I do think that higher education globally has a massive role to play in resisting that and truly creating something that is borderless. And for me, the exciting thing about Borderless at the moment is it's been quite one-directional up to this point. So, and that's been towards the main English-speaking destination countries, Canada, Australia, UK, US, and I see that changing. There's a supply and demand issue. There's more kind of middle class than there ever has been, and that middle class is coming out of Asia. And so I see Borderless higher education as a kind of two-way directional movement of students throughout the world. So countries that have traditionally been sending countries actually become recruiting countries.
And if I could just add to that, when we spend at Shorelight some time in China, we hear from the Ministry of Education, as I'm sure you do, that we don't just want to have our students coming to the United States. We want to make sure there's real exchange. And then when we're working with American universities, our American university partners will say to us, what of our domestic kids get a lot out of it. They get an opportunity to learn in a more global environment. But what about opportunities for study abroad that are maybe different than like what I did when I studied at King's College in the UK when I was at Johns Hopkins, but maybe culturally more of a stretch. Can they go to Beijing or Shanghai or Chengdu or wherever? And people are looking for that kind of exchange, so I think you're exactly right.
Great. So let's dig a little bit deeper on the drivers for this change as well. And I think one of the things that I've definitely observed recently is the huge sort of millennial audience that's pushing through. They tend to have 47 careers every 2 years these days. They are very global citizens. They like to travel the world. There's this blending between learning, working, and traveling. Has the panel got any thoughts on those trends and how they're affecting this international education market?
We only have one millennial on the stage, So
Lucy, I think.
Lucy.
Sure. No, I was just thinking. I think one of the things that is actually probably appropriate, to be honest, is that I think millennials they think they think very carefully about purchasing decisions, even though in a lot of cases they are not necessarily the ones who are purchasing that decision. And certainly on our platform, so we do a lot around data science to actually kind of curate appropriate matches for students. And there's this philosophy of you don't need to know what you don't know. We might recommend you a program in Hong Kong or a kind of an emerging program at Manchester University in the UK. So what we tend to find is that students in a single session are shortlisting 25 different programs, and they're coming back time and time again. And I think, I'm always shocked at sort of actually, these are 16, 17-year-olds, how diligent they are in their thinking process, and how sort of iterative it is for them. And it makes me think, sort of on the university side, how kind of carefully you have to really market yourselves or position yourselves to this audience of consumers of media in a way that's never been done before. And certainly I think that's then reflected on sort of the purchasing side as well.
And I would, to echo that, there's some research that Hobson's has done which shows a direct correlation between how active an institution is on social media and the number of international students at their institution. So I think meeting the student where they are in the method that they want to be interacted with, and then that continual contact with them in a way that engages them is absolutely vital. And I would go as far as saying, education is always getting pushed by the consumer world, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be in terms of meeting the student where they are.
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind for me, Riley. One is, in our core business, our university partners, as a consequence of their students, they're seeking a really diverse student body to study with. The millennials, if I may, they want to study with people from all around the world. They want that exposure because they know that's the world that they'll be working in the future. If you look at models like Minerva, like what Ben's trying to do there, that whole model is about taking cohorts around the world, and that'll be more challenging, I suspect, in this scalable borderless environment. But maybe there's a blended model for international education, and that's what we're talking about.
This issue of meeting the student where they are, I think that all of us have ways of doing that now through digital marketing. So in my organization at Shorelight, we have a partnership with U.S. News and World Report, and we've created a division called U.S. News Global Education. And there's 12 million unique visitors from outside the United States who come to the U.S. News properties to get information. And I'm just talking in a U.S.-centric way right now about those U.S. universities. And with our partners at U.S. News, we've been able to completely change the interface so that it is designed to support better decision-making for those students. One of the things that we at Shorelight work with agencies around the world, and we're going to do that for as long as I can imagine. But we do know that we can't just work with agencies, and one, because I don't think we can get the diversity that we need if we are solely reliant on agencies, and two, because increasingly students are going to be looking, if we want to meet them where they are, they're not always going to an agent's office. And we believe that in order for us to represent the universities the right way and allow the student and the parent to make a heart-based purchase, which is the way so many of us decide where we want to go to school, rather than a features and benefits, sort of a spec sheet environment purchase, that it's really important that we have a channel mix that includes both.
Yeah, I agree. And when you were talking about diversification, and that's what people want, I do think that the kind of borderless higher education moving forward, some of the things that have been very attractive for destination countries like lifestyle or big city or whatever, they're still going to be really important. But that multicultural element, multi-language element within the classroom, I think is important, that experience, that genuine international experience.
And one of the other trends that we talked about briefly prior today was some newer countries that were coming through that were driving some of this change as well. So we've got the traditional markets of the US, Australia, UK and Canada that international students want to come to, but we've got this rising middle class in Asia, and the domestic universities and education is improving in those markets. But there's also countries in perhaps Singapore and the Netherlands and in the Middle East that are really upping their game and taking on some of that demand as well.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, the middle class is growing. Something like 60% of that middle class growth is going to come from Asia, and there's always going to be. And then you have to look at the huge countries like China. They're always going to want to send students internationally. We were talking about it earlier, that sea turtle effect, the idea that they go abroad and come back and then work in the family business, etc., is always going to be important. But they're also developing themselves, and as are other countries, Singapore, Korea, etc., Malaysia, as destination countries. And in fact, this year, I think China became the second biggest international student recruiter after the USA. So, it's happening already. That's quite regional as far as the international recruitment, but that will change and they'll start hitting those markets like the Middle East, etc.
Yeah, just to add to that, I completely agree with Jeremy, and I think what we see is the fact that this sort of, I think universities would be remiss to not make themselves aware of these sort of changes in sort of demographic trends. It's not the case anymore that you're going east-west exclusively. And I think what's really interesting is if you actually examine the markets like Germany and the Netherlands and Hong Kong, who have done an incredible job of actually kind of rebranding themselves in the eyes of a certain kind of globally mobile student audience. And, I think what's also really interesting, coming from the UK, where I spend a lot of my time and then splitting my time as well in Asia, the British universities have sort of sat there and rested on their laurels for quite a long period of time, and they have the reputation and the history to support that. But then you have universities in China like Peking University, Tsinghua University. Tsinghua University, actually, a kind of close colleague of mine who was a Rhodes Scholar, is now setting up a program to rival the Rhodes Scholarship. And just learning a little bit about what that program entails, it's incredible, the amount of support, the opportunities, the diversity of students they are bringing to that program. And so I think in a short period of time, I think these new brands that are in fact not shackled in the way that some of at least the British universities are, that can kind of embrace the new and certainly have the funding to experiment and to do so. I think that's going to create a really sort of interesting challenge in sort of how and where students choose to pursue higher education.
Yeah, we're still, the conversation is still framed on, travelling to the US, Australia, Canada to study, not, a lot of my son, who I'm talking to, he wants to study in China. Because
you should.
Right. Yeah. Because it's like, well, that's boring. Everyone studies, Australia. And apparently I've looked at all the graphs, Dad, and everyone's going to be in China and India. And I think, perhaps our frame of reference is so self-centered. We're not thinking, we're thinking digital. I think that's on the agenda, and we're all still trying to work out how to do that at scale well and deliver student outcomes and student experience. But maybe we're just looking at it from the whole wrong dimension, because this wave of international education has been happening for so long and so strongly.
Okay.
Just one comment about the U.S., and it's not meant to be self-serving or U.S.-centric because I'm American. The data that we have suggests that the vast majority of the 4.5 million students who study outside their home country every year want to come to the United States. So it should get updated. We're talking about how things are maybe changing, but last I looked, it was 3.5 million of the 4.5 million internationally mobile students say the U.S. is their #1 destination of choice. Only 1 million of those students actually study in the U.S., so that's 1 million of our 21 million college students. So we're under 5% international in this country, where Canada's 12%, and I think the UK's 19%, and this number always looks smaller to me than, but I understand that Australia's 23%. And now in the United States, American universities have this rising supply, and it's trying to meet this ever-present global demand. And so it could be that everything's changing and people are starting to say, you know what, no thanks, it's not, we want to look at China or other places. But I think we're going to see some interesting things in the United States as U.S. universities, I'm not saying they're waking up because I think they've already fully aware of it, say, we want to get the best and brightest from all over the world, and we're willing to work hard at it rather than just see who comes.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a really interesting sort of supply and demand thing going on there. What about the economic side of things? What about the, I know there's a rising middle class in Asia that we've just talked about, but what about the students that perhaps can't afford to come all the way to the US or Australia, the UK? What are you seeing the trends in those countries? Is that a reason for some of these newer countries that are bringing through new offerings? Is part of it an economic decision? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure Tom sees the same, but it's a, and Lucy talked about it, it's a massive purchase decision. It's a lot of money. It's traveling away from home. And so, the economics only work out for some, very, very few probably. When you think about the scale, we're comparing all the ratios to us, percentage of our student body, not the ratios of, divided by China. That's a tiny number. Yeah. Your billion students
Yep.
number as well. So, and perhaps it's not the same traditional form of higher education that we think of today, but I've no doubt, and I've heard a few snippets while I've been here as well, it's that, Lucy, your thing about building universities 2 a day or whatever it was, like, we're just not going to be able to do that, right? So we need to find another way to bring all of, the billion learners and skill them up. And we're still thinking about the economy we're in today, maybe a service-based economy, or not the economy of 10 or 20 years. If my son, he's not going to be at work for 10 years or so. The kids that are born today, goodness, that'll be a different international education market, I think.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, I think yourselves and Deloitte did this big piece of research in Australia that said the next tranche of international students, this huge growth, isn't going to be at the same cost per student model. It can't be as we currently have. So I think, going back to your innovation in the US, I absolutely think people are going to come up with innovative ways to supply a high value degree through a combination of blended or online or in country, but in a way that has a cheaper price point. And I think, I don't have a clue what that looks like really, but and it could take a lot of different forms, and some of that's going to exist in countries like China and Malaysia, and some of that, as you say, is going to be really innovative thinking around how to deliver a high quality degree to an international student in the US at a price point that is affordable to the next wave of these billion learners.
I'll be brief on this, but I can give you one example. So UMass Amherst is offering, in partnership with us at Shorelight, an electrical engineering master's degree program in Shanghai in collaboration with Shanghai Jiaotong University. It's not a dual degree, but it's a dual campus experience. And so we have a technology platform called the Shorelight Global Reach Platform, which allows us to have UMass Amherst faculty deliver live instruction to students who are physically in Shanghai, physically together in the same room, going to labs. And for people who don't know, Shanghai Jiaotong University is a top-ranked university in China. And so even though it's not a dual degree, there's something about going physically to this high-quality university, being taught by a high-quality faculty member at a U.S. institution, and then walking away with a U.S. degree. And it's asset light, tech heavy, and it allows the price point to go down.
Yes, let's talk a little bit more about business models. So with all of this change in the economics that we've just been talking about, it surely means that universities and higher ed providers and everyone that sort of fits into around the industry is going to need to think about changing their business model, adapting. It might be cost efficiencies through online delivery. What are you seeing? What do you think is crucial for perhaps the university folk in the room in terms of thinking about how their business model can improve and make the most of this of these changes?
Yeah, well, I could talk a little bit about the top of the funnel, I guess, which is that most universities are still over-reliant on a few core markets. And what we've seen in the UK with the institutions that we work with is that's how you get your fingers burnt. The post-study work visa for Indians stopped in the UK, and UK universities that were recruiting Indian students had a real challenge, or have a real challenge. I think institutions are going to have to get more sophisticated about how they build the cohorts of students that they go after, rather than just say we'll have a China strategy or an India strategy. They've got to say, okay, what's the cohort of students that are successful at my institution? Is it about lifestyle or value for money or security or safety or whatever? And then build a profile that they can actually market to that bridges multiple countries and diversifies their initial funnel, because you still look at the vast majority of universities in the UK, Australia, or the US, and there's an over-reliance on a few countries.
Okay. Any more thoughts?
Surely price can't keep going up. I would have thought from an economic perspective, price is going to go down, and subsidy or student support from government is going to go down, and that's more price pressure. I think in the pricing side, a lot of our university partners who are delivering programs like Tom talked about, that they have a price issue as well, as they're pricing in every market at once around the world. And in a cohort model, when you're delivering to multiple countries as well, student support is 24/7. The millennials, then the next generation, are incredibly demanding. They want a return on investment, and so I don't know. The economics suggest that we've actually got to change something. We can't do it the same way. There's something we've got to change, and I suppose that's what certainly our models rely on, is public-private partnerships, of saying, you guys are really, really good at that, and we're really, really good at this, so why don't we team up?
I think, just to add to that, I think, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I would agree totally with Tom, that I think there is, and I think this will continue to be the case for a long time, there is a quality in the educational offerings of the countries that we've talked about that I think certainly will continue to be the case. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with wanting to absorb and consume it and learn from the best. I think, to your point, there are really interesting ways, I would imagine, of sort of stripping out some of the unnecessary costs, the kind of legacy support infrastructures of some of these institutions in actually delivering that quality of education. And, there's a couple of examples that are going about it from a very different way, but, we, in our platform, our entire philosophy is sort of using predictive analytics to map out and project out the appropriate pathways for students. Now, I can see a time when that could be a General Assembly course, and until the point at which we actually have very clear evidence that there is a similar return on sort of employability or sort of outcome, until we can get that data, we won't actually list them on our platform. But there's really interesting models like that are stripping away a ton of the cost of providing that learning experience. And then if you look on the university side, you have one very strong example in Minerva, which is taking this incredible concept of liberal arts, blended core curriculum learning, which is modeled in the IB curricula, which is the fastest growing curriculum in the world. There's certainly not going to be a kind of weakening demand, I think, for that kind of education. But what seems to me at least so smart about Minerva is let's use technology to cut costs. Let's take teachers from different environments, plug them in sort of a temporary capacity so that you don't have people on tenure. I mean, it feels like, to your point, Patrick, that universities can feed this continued demand for this quality Western education if they are willing to innovate on how they deliver that.
And I'll just add that I think universities are becoming more focused in their approach. So imagine if every business had the exact same strategy. And I'm not saying that every university in the United States, but we want to go up in the rankings. We're going to launch more programs. We're going to be in more locations. And you listen. If you were to just look at all the inaugurations of presidents and what they say they're going to do, everybody's going to the same place. But how could everybody have the same strategy and win? When we wrote a white paper on college financial sustainability, the we being when I was at Sterling Partners with Bain & Company, we did a sort of a play on words with Moore's Law, and we called that philosophy, which many universities are not employing now. So we called it the Law of More. At that point, it was more diverse program offerings, more locations, all these things that would drive costs up. And to Patrick's point about partnering, and we all do that. We say, well, what's our core? How can we differentiate ourselves? Where do we really want to focus? I was in here at on the panel beforehand. I was hearing somebody talk about Georgia State. I think that's, I used to live in Atlanta. That's a university that has decided we're going to be a certain thing, and we're not going to be all things. And in that certain thing that we're going to be really unique and drive towards outcomes, and we're going to partner for these other things that we need. And so I have a lot of respect for university administrators. I sit down and talk to them and feel like, we have a lot to learn as business people listening to them. In some ways, they have harder jobs. It's like moving a tanker for them to change the behaviors, and they've got faculty and faculty senates to deal with. But strategically, I think the tanker's starting to turn.
Yeah, and we touched on this. I just want to go back to your point, Lucy, talking about, you mentioned General Assembly, and there's the boot camp models and Minerva. There's Mission U, which is a new startup that has a 1-year undergraduate degree from what I know about it. I think there's two big costs associated with making a large purchase decision, as you said, Patrick, in taking a degree. It's the cost, but it's also the time of taking a 4-year degree and doing that all up the front of your career. So do you think that universities should be looking more at these shorter format courses that lead to more specific but different outcomes?
Yeah, I think the answer is it needs a combination of all of it. It's going to stratify. I mean, there is value to a 4-year degree around a lifestyle and around things that you can't just encompass in an ROI saying, I then ended up getting a great job at the end that delivered X. And that's going to work for some parts of society, and for some students, there's going to be a demand for a different type of degree that is shorter and more value-driven. And I really like the concept of, you only pay for your degree, once you get a job that's worth X amount, which I think is the Mission U thing. So I actually think there's room for all levels of this kind of education concept, and I think it will stratify. And I also think universities have to think about how they're enabling the student to face society. We all talk about the fact that 90% of jobs that are out there, aren't in existence today, in 5 years' time. And I think universities have to think about a more holistic approach to educating the student. And I think there's some really interesting work being done around that, around course content and development. So I would say there will be lots of different times. It doesn't spell the death of a 4-year degree or a 3-year degree, but it's certainly, I think there's going to be innovative ways of offering a degree which will work for some cohorts, but not for others.
Yeah, I just think we need to be incredibly dispassionate about what it looks like and focus on whatever it is that's going to meet the learner's needs. And there was a session earlier today around unbundling higher ed and rebundling it. And I think it was kind of acknowledging that, there are some tankers out there that are hard to change. And I don't envy the role of a vice-chancellor or a provost or a president. Oh my goodness, that is a really hard job. But there's some things that those institutions do that are incredible, and they have some amazing skill sets as well. But I don't think that should stop you just being really dispassionate and adopting these, user experience principles everyone's looking at. Is what is it that the learner needs, and how do we deliver that in a way that's cost effective, that's global, that meets their needs? It seems in the conversation where we always tiptoe around, anything that will change the current system, and I understand that from a change management perspective. But at some point in time, we've really got to be brave and, take a learner perspective and rebuild that learner experience. But it's easier said than done.
Yeah, it's definitely a big job. So let's talk a little bit about the student recruitment and enrollment vendors and agents that are a really important and big part of the international education market as we know it. What do these changes mean for those providers, and what are the things for them to look out for?
I can start, if it's okay. So when we have an opportunity to go and speak with agencies around the world, and there's going to be more in China than other places. I sense with them, and they're our partners too, that they're under pressure. You know, sometimes they'll tell you, and sometimes you can just see it in their body language, that it's harder for agencies to differentiate themselves. You know, their markets may not be growing, and they're trying to figure out, well, what else can we put together for our students? What other services can we provide that makes agent A better than agent, you know, B, C, D, or E? And so I feel like that's a market that's very much in flux. You know, not to say that we all won't be able to rely on the fact that many parents, because as Patrick said, it's such a massive investment, are going to go to agents. They need someone who they feel like knows the rules of the road to advise them. But I think the agencies are going to change significantly over time. And then all of us who work with them, whether you're a university or whether you're, you know, a partner to a university like we are going to have to stay out in front of those changes because it's a moving target.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Tom and I are a different part of the ecosystem than you guys, but you know, looking back into those markets are disrupting themselves as well. Yeah, we take a very kind of personally centric perspective on it. But last year at ASU, I sat in on a few presentations from you know, China-based startups who had identified that market for disruption, and so. And then I hear about the work that you guys are doing, you know, incredibly, you know, adopting all the digital consumer-facing smarts to help learners make that kind of investment decision too. So
yeah, I think that was the other thing I was going to add, is sort of twisting the I think this concept of student agent university slightly, and enabling, you know, other routes and sort of pathways. And certainly I think in our experience, you know, a lot of, in our conversations with international secondary schools, a lot of the reason why parents historically have felt the need, I think, or that their only option was to seek support in the form of an agent, was that they didn't feel within the secondary school they had the kind of quality or the depth of expertise to be able to advise across a range of national landscapes. And you know, Jeremy and I represent businesses that are, in one way or another, very much actively trying to use predictive analytics, to use data, to use technology to empower the secondary schools to slightly disintermediate this process. But I think, you know, I think that's a good thing. I mean, you know, from our perspective, it's delivering a kind of quality decision-making support at a kind of fraction of the cost, in fact, compared to what a lot of these families are having to shell out for sometimes, you know, sometimes quite questionable advice.
Yeah, I just think I absolutely agree. It's about informed decisions, and I think you have to look at the consumer world to see where you go for informed decisions and how quickly you can make informed decisions on everything from buying a pair of shoes to buying a car. And I still think that that's quite challenging for students to make truly informed decisions. And I think at that front end, you know, the work that we're doing, but equally the work that we all do in trying to educate the student in country, you know, there's a variety of different methods, but it's going to have to be all about making informed decisions and putting the power in the students' hands.
Okay. Any final comments? On the EdTech side of things, it's an EdTech conference, so I think it's definitely right for us to talk about this. Where does this technology fit into this whole piece, this borderless, scalable education? Like we said, we can't be setting up physical campuses all around the world. It's a little bit too expensive and hard to implement. So where does the technology piece come into it? And is it just online learning, or is it all parts of the value chain? Where does it fit in?
I know that we at Shorelight think it's all parts of the value chain. So we have this thing I mentioned, it's called the Shorelight Global Reach Platform. And REACH is an acronym, and we're trying to achieve global reach for our students and for our universities. But we think of the student life cycle, and we break it down into 5 distinct buckets: research, enroll, acclimate, complete, and hire, because they need to go out and get jobs. And then we provide personalized digital support for students throughout the life cycle. You know, I already mentioned a couple of things, but, you know, we focus on digital marketing through U.S. News Global Education. We focus on hybrid delivery through the platform, and UMass Amherst was an example. And then we have something we call the Commons, which is that personalized digital concierge, which supports the student from the second they say, we announced a partnership with the University of Utah earlier today. So second a student decides they're going to come here to Salt Lake City, and they've been admitted, they're being supported by the platform. And we think that will help achieve better student outcomes and better student outcomes at scale.
Yeah, it's the whole life cycle. We know we just completed a massive piece of work. We mapped 5,000 EdTech companies, and we found 23 innovation clusters that go all the way from learning design and creating awesome learning experiences to advancing into a role. We've got a session at 11 a.m. tomorrow if you'd like to check that out in more detail. But it is the whole life cycle. It's not just one point. I think too often we either go to boot camps or we go to LMSs or something like that. There's incredible innovation happening across the whole life cycle.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. And I think the other thing that I would say, which is, I think always the case in education, and sometimes for those of us who are sort of more focused or orientated around the sort of the deeper parts of the technology, it's always a little jarring to hear, what's actually going to move the needle and help customers. And certainly, it's been multiple conversations that I've had with our schools in places like India and, Surabaya, Indonesia, where, literally the kind of crux of the pain is uploading documents and sort of submitting them and getting that to be recognized in a kind of credentialed way by the recipient institution. So I think there's actually a lot of work to be done on sort of basic workflow optimization on the tech side as well, which, can feel boring, but is extremely important and ultimately kind of makes the whole thing turn.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is it's absolutely along the whole student life cycle and the whole academic cycle. I think infrastructure, we have to also be aware, is a global issue when we're talking about technology. And we've got to, not that we can necessarily solve it here, but that's a real challenge in some countries for many, many students. And so, that needs to be thought through as we think about solutions that can fit a broader community of students globally.
Okay. Let's change pace a little bit. I wanted to get the panel's thoughts on perhaps we could call it the Trump effect, and we should not forget Brexit as well in terms of the policies that are coming through that perhaps in the US give a bit of a posture of closed for business. What are they doing to the demand for students wanting to come into the US and the UK?
So we do a survey, international student survey of about 65,000 students a year, and without a doubt, Trump is having an effect. And a year ago we did a survey about the Brexit, and without a doubt the Brexit was having an effect on the UK and continues to have an effect. I do think, I'll get on my soapbox a bit, that, we mix up, or it is mixed up in terms of bad immigration and good immigration and international students. Every piece of survey we do, the general public do not think of international students as bad immigration. That's certainly the research that we have for the UK. The things that are having an impact is, our research shows that it's course, country, and then university in those three choices on where people go. And so there's a lot of work UK universities have done collectively. London is open, We Are International, UK, British Council, etc. They've got together and they've really pushed out a message. And we did a piece of research last year on students' perceptions of the Brexit, and they were very concerned. This year, a lot less concerned. So I do think that universities being outward-facing, having an international message collectively, working with organisations like NAFSA or British Council can have an impact on those perceptions.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, I mean, one of the things that I think will need to be the case is that there'll be a kind of bottoms-up effect of sort of rebuilding trust and sort of the concept in the minds of schools and students that they will not face discrimination in this process. And I think that will genuinely need to happen through a ripple effect of, in 2017, Lucy gained acceptance to University of Minnesota. That means that all the younger students who are looking to the older class of graduates will say, okay, it's sort of safe to go. And I say that because I think there's a lot of, unfortunately in some cases, a lot of the decision making within secondary schools does happen like that. There's this really powerful sort of network effect of, where students are able to sort of progress onto, especially if you have a small class and they're applying to 18 countries. You only have a few evidence points. So it feels to me that there sort of will be a ripple effect of rebuilding that trust sort of from the ground up.
Patrick?
Yeah, we've got partnerships in Australia, the UK, the US and Canada. So we can definitely already see those different flows. I think we're waiting to see what this summer looks like in the US from a short-term perspective. But I think from a long-term perspective, kind of reflecting on the conversation we had, it would be naive to, as a country, to not continue for all of the great reasons, whether it's institutional diversity, whether it's, relationships, geopolitical relationships, what the students are actually seeking themselves to do that. And perhaps this was a phase we needed to go through to learn that. But I think we've got a way to go to get some evidence to back up what we're talking about as well. Some of these things only happened really recently and the purchasing decision of a student or a set of parents studying overseas, so I understand, is quite long. And so maybe the other story I keep hearing is maybe we'll see this and it will play out over the next few years, because the parents who a few months ago were sitting around the kitchen table deciding where their child was going to go to study, that some of those decisions won't flow out for 2 or 3 years.
So, I would agree with that. We took a look back 27 years since 1990, and there's been 3 years since 1990 when there were slight dips in international student flows coming into the United States. And it wasn't in 2002 when we dropped 2%. It was in 2003. And then it was 1% in 2004, and it was 0.5% in 2005. I'm not trying to equate this environment with what happened at 9/11. I can tell you, we had a board of directors meeting on November 8th, 2016, and we said, look, everybody thinks, this thing is going to go one way, but if you believe Nate Silver, there's a 30% chance it could go the other way. So if it goes the other way, and unlike Navitas, we're not diversified. We've got one partner in the UK, and it's really a study abroad relationship for us. So we're all about the United States. We're not bullish because it just serves us to be bullish on student flows. We just think that if there is a drop, and I don't think it'll be this year, I think it would maybe be in future years, and it depends how people respond. What we're seeing is, and Patrick and I have talked about this offline, the You Are Welcome Here campaign from our American university presidents and leadership, and the way that so many people have come together and say that we stand for internationalization. And I asked right before the election our partner in the UK, Christy Slade, the Vice Chancellor, at Brexit, what happened after that? And she said, we as universities felt that we needed to come together and represent the internationalization, sort of the importance of internationalization, and really lead. And so in some ways, I feel like it's brought us closer to some of our university partners, because we feel like, what we hold dear is in some way under attack. And so it does remain to be seen, but I think that lag trend that you talked about, at least it was proven out after 9/11.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more quick question. I'd just like to kind of whip across the panel and, excuse me, I pose the question of what does a successful global higher education institution look like in 2025?
I said it already, but because I see we've got a minute, I will say it's asset light, tech heavy, student focused.
Yeah, I like Tom's strategy before. I think it'll be focused, really, really focused. Lots of different universities focused, not a vanilla model the way we talk about it today.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I think the one piece that I think is missing is you don't have to sacrifice. You don't have to sacrifice quality of education for maintaining bridges to the labour markets, which are hugely important for students today. And I definitely think that the University of 2025 will really be able to kind of integrate that concept into the learning experience.
Yeah, and I would say student-centric and truly outward-looking.
Great. Okay, if you could all please put your hands together for the panel. Thank you everyone for coming along. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.